Okay, so today we're going to talk about density. Density is a physical property of matter. We have not discussed it yet because it's a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to break it down for you. So remember, a physical property is any characteristic that you can tell me about a substance. Each substance has its own kind of density, its own density. And density means the amount of particles or mass in a certain amount of space, which is known as volume. So, for example, if we stated that something is more dense, then it means that there's more stuff in a space. And if it's less dense, then it has less stuff in a space. For example, density is denoted by the big letter D, equals mass versus volume. So mass over volume is density. This is the amount of stuff in the amount of space. Now, when we measure mass, you know that mass is measured in the form of grams, denoted by the G. And volume, we can find volume two different ways. So it can either be in the measurement of centimeters cubed, like with our gummy bears, or, I'm going to teach you this today, it can also be in milliliters. So your answer can be how many grams in how many centimeters cubed, or how many grams in how many milliliters. And depending on that answer, you will know whether or not something is more dense or less dense than water. Now, how we measure mass is with a triple beam balance, and it is measured in grams. You don't need to write this, but the next part is how do we measure volume? Now, there are two ways depending on the object's shape. They are called regular objects and irregular objects. Let's begin with regular objects. How do we measure volume for regular shaped objects? Now, regular shaped objects are objects that have distinct, straight, easy lines that you can put a ruler to, and they are normal shapes on all sides. So, for example, we're going to use a ruler. Here is a box or a cube, and the way that we find volume using a ruler is we have to multiply the length times the width times the height. So if you're looking at this cube, the length is here, the width is this way, and the height is the up and down arrow. So for example, with this cube, we have the length as being 6, and we have 4 centimeters for the width, and we have 7 centimeters for the height. So when we multiply that, we have 6 times 4 times 7. Remember to always keep the measurements, the units of measurement, and so you have 168 centimeters cubed if I did my math correct. So your volume is 168 centimeters cubed. Pretty easy how to find the measurement for volume using a ruler on nicely shaped objects. Now, what happens if you have an object that has many different strange shapes? For example, objects that have shapes like this, or a key. It would be really difficult, and I would say impossible, to use a ruler to measure the height, the width, and the length, because the width is different at this point versus at the long stick point right here. And for a marble, I mean, how would you find the length, the width, and the height when it's round? Or even circular like this, or odd shaped in many different shapes here, for example, these are called irregular shaped objects. So there's a different way to find it. Instead of using a ruler, we use a graduated cylinder. And I'm just going to show the rest of these notes, and there is a picture below, so don't be alarmed, I'm going to explain it. So when you're using a graduated cylinder to find the volume of an irregular shaped object, all you have to do is put water into the cylinder. So for example here, we put 200 milliliters of water in a graduated cylinder. Then you slide the object in the object that is irregularly shaped, and you want to know the volume. And whatever the difference is, that will be your volume. So when you put this rock in here, you notice that the level rises to about 260, because you got 220, 40, 60. So 260. So if you take 260 and you subtract it from 200, you should have 60. And because we did this in liquid, our measurement will be in milliliters. Pretty easy. Let's try one more. Here we have how many milliliters in this graduated cylinder. Here's 50, 55, 60. So that should be 56 milliliters. This object looks like another rock. When you put it in, it rises 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's one notch away from 60, which would make that 59. If you subtract these two numbers, you should get the volume of the object. Do you know the answer? If you said 3 milliliters, you are correct. Now, in order to know whether or not something floats in water, we need to know what the density of water as a liquid is. Now, the cool thing about the density of liquid water is that the mass is equal to the same number of its volume. So the amount of mass is equal to the volume. For example, the density equals 1 gram, so we have 1 gram of molecules of H2O over 1 centimeters cubed of volume. So it's a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter cube. There's 1 gram in there. Notice the two ones here, 1 and 1, gives you a density of 1 gram per centimeters cubed. That is a very important thing to remember when we're trying to figure out if something floats in water. Now, if we did this, for example, we said, oh, but I have 4 grams of water. Well, if you have 4 grams of water, you have 4 grams of volume, which would therefore equal the same exact number, 1 gram per centimeters cubed. If you're wondering why, it's because the 4 crosses out and then you are left with the number 1. So the density of water is 1 grams per centimeters cubed. Or you could also say 1 grams per milliliters cubed. It is the same exact density. Now, when you want to know if something floats in water, all you have to remember is that if the mass is less than the volume, then it will float. So let's take a look. Here we have a number 1 over the amount of volume. If this number is less than the volume, then you know it will float. If you solve for this by taking your calculator and dividing 1 divided by 2, you would get an answer of 0.5 or half grams per centimeters cubed. So that would be the answer of the density. Does it float? Yes, because the mass is less than the volume. Now, here is another example. If the mass, 2, is less than the volume, 6, this will also float. If you were to divide this, this would be 1/3, and if you were to divide on a calculator 1 divided by 3, you would get 0.333333 forever. 0.33, sorry. 0.33 grams per milliliters. And it would float. Now, if something sinks in water, you already know that if something floats in water, the mass is less than the volume. If the mass is more than the volume, then it will float, or then it will sink. For example, 2 grams of mass in 1 centimeters cubed volume. The 2 is greater than the 1. the mass is greater than the volume. So it will sink. If you solve for this, 1 goes in a tube twice. So your answer would be D equals 2 grams per centimeters cubed. Now, let me give you an example of milliliters. If I have 5 grams of mass over 3 grams of milliliters, that means I have 5 grams inside 3 milliliters of space. 5 is greater than 3, therefore this will sink. If I divide this, 5 divided by 3 on my calculator, I will get 1.66 grams per milliliter. Therefore, it will sink. Now, let's wrap this up. Mass is less than the volume. When the mass is less than the volume, then it will float. If the mass is more than the volume, the object will sink in water. For example, we have these examples. Here is the mass is less than the volume, it will float. If the mass is greater than the volume, then it will sink. This is the density of water, 1 gram over 1 gram. Now, when you do the division for this right here, this density, 1 divided by 2 is 0.5 grams per centimeters cubed. 1 divided by 1 is 1 grams per milliliter, or 1 grams per centimeters cubed, and this is the density of water. For density of an object that is 2 divided by 1, you get 2 grams per centimeters cubed. Now, do you notice anything about these numbers? 0.5, 1, and 2. Notice that if the density is less than 1, which is less than the density of water, it will float. And if the density is greater than the density of water, it will, and let's change this, it will sink. There we go. So if it's more than 1, then it will sink. All right. That is all of our notes for the day. See you in class.